welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to have you here for the launch of the latest edition of Early Childhood Matters, which the Van Leer Foundation has been producing for 25 years or so. This year and also next year, we decided to focus on the topic of the well-being of parents and caregivers. And so I just wanted to make a couple introductory remarks about why we chose to do that. And then I will pass over to our guest editor and host for today, Tanmoy Goswami. It's asking me to confirm my speaking language, and it says it sounds like Turkish. So that's not the case. I'm not sure what to, there, English, okay. So I should say, I've been at the foundation for a long time. I work on early childhood in different roles, but also a father of a now 9-year-old girl, and the experience of having a kid definitely changed my perspective on my work. And I think I became far more in tune with and sympathetic to the experience of the parents and the caregivers than I was before that. And I started to reflect on the way that folks like myself who work in early childhood see or don't see parents. And if we look back at the history of this field in our foundation, 50, 60 years ago, the conventional wisdom was there's not much going on in babies' brains, sort of wait till they get bigger. And that changed, and you look today and they're the smartest people on the planet. And that's had a really positive effect in some way. I just saw Joan Lombardi join, who knows the history much better than I do. A very positive effect in some way, because it's become of much greater interest to people, to policymakers, and we've seen a lot of movement on that front. But it's also come with a lot more pressure and expectation of parents and caregivers of what we're supposed to do with babies and toddlers. And it's happened right in this historical moment where more and more human beings have moved to cities, where more and more women have joined the formal workforce, and we live further and further away from our extended family. And so suddenly we're expected to do a lot more, but we have a lot less help. And I think that's the issue that we wanted to draw attention to, and to ask the question, how are we going to in the future better take care of the people who take care of children every day, including ourselves. And so this edition, which is also part of a bigger push at the foundation to focus on this in our programming, was intended to just start a conversation to unpack what we mean by the well-being of parents and caregivers. What do we know about the science? What are some interesting initiatives people are taking? But just to open up the conversation, which we want to keep having with you all and others for the next year, also in our programs, so that we can go deeper into different parts of this in the forthcoming edition. So that's where I'll leave it for now. I'll come back at the end briefly. But with that, I would like to pass it over to Tanmoy, who described himself in our last phone call as a fumbling father. And that's the phrase I've actually in several calls subsequently been using to describe myself. So from one fumbling father to another, please take us to the next part of the conversation, Tanmoy.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm pleased that that term is finding wider resonance across the world. So thanks for that. Just to take off from what Mike said, when I started working on this edition as the guest editor, I had this epiphany that a confident, self-assured parent or caregiver today is a bit like a unicorn. They don't exist. And I started investigating along with this remarkable team, the advisory board, why that is the case. And that brought us to then questions of economics, some of which Mike has touched upon in his remarks. My name is Tanmoy. I live up on the hills in the south of India. I am a father to a 6-year-old. I am a past fellow of the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, and I created a platform called Sanity, which is an independent mental health storytelling platform based here in India. And I also live with chronic mental illness, and I hope you're not able to tell, but I'm extremely nervous right now. I'm very thankful to the foundation for allowing us to engage with a theme that is at once commonsensical and very radical, which is what does care mean for caregivers? Now, why is it so radical? Because to understand, to even pose that question, is to first grant that parents and caregivers have their own personhood, that they're human beings in their own right, and not just machines or foot soldiers in our sort of culture's quest to raise children efficiently, whatever that means. And we have been very unapologetic about centering that humanity, centering that personhood. And we were fortunate to have worked with some really, really stellar minds who resoundingly supported that view. So that was the first epiphany that I had, that this is a theme that is deceptively simple, yet very, 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 very counterintuitive. And secondly, I wondered throughout this journey that as a journal that's not in the breaking news race, how do we address the trifecta of violent conflict, of climate change, and deepening inequality in vast parts of the world, and their impact on parents and caregivers with a solutions orientation, which is what this journal is known for, and do all of that in a single edition. I was very relieved when Michael and the rest of the foundation team told me that this issue is just the starting point in this conversation, that we are not going to attempt to be prescriptive, that we are going to ask some questions with a lot of humility, and that as a team, they're committed to listen deeply and engage with these themes in subsequent editions. So thanks and kudos for the foundation for having that foresight. So thanks again, Mike, Hannah, Charlotte, Margaret, Andrew, Laura, our great advisory board, and all of you for showing up today. And for those of you who walked with me on this journey, which lasted about 7-8 months, thank you, big thanks. All right, it's time for me to introduce the amazing voices that we have with us this evening. First, we have Sabrina Habib. Sabrina, if you could just wave. Sabrina is the co-founder and chief exploration officer of Kidogo, which is a Kenya-based social venture that is building a network of quality, affordable childcare centers in East Africa's low-income communities, while creating livelihood opportunities for women that Kidogo calls mamapreneurs. And one of my absolute favorite stories in this edition is that of Lydia Sabrina, who's a mamapreneur. And Sabrina quotes Lydia in a story, "My husband was unemployed for 5 months, and it was my business that paid our rent and fed our family. My husband spread the news in our village that I had qualified as a Kidogo mamapreneur, and some came to celebrate with us." That's just beautiful. So welcome, Sabrina. It's my pleasure to introduce Harriet Shugarman, inaugural co-chair of the Advisory Council of Our Kids Climate in New York. Now, poverty and climate change are intersecting crises. And as with Sabrina's piece, what I love most about your article, Harriet, on parents tackling climate anxiety, which you co-authored with Anya Kamenetz, is the emphasis on how parents led by mothers are empowering themselves in the face of climate catastrophes, and how they're learning to devise a language to talk about this very complex, very fraught issue with their children. So thank you for writing for us, and welcome, Harriet. Okay, next we have Nikhil Chaudhary, assistant professor in human, evolutionary, and behavioral ecology at the University of Cambridge, UK. I had not heard about that field until I discovered Nikhil's absolutely stunning research. Nikhil's worked with the Bayaka hunter-gatherer community in Congo, and his findings really drive home that all of this talk about care and childcare and all of that is great, but we must first address a very deep and fundamental problem in the way a lot of modern urban societies are organized. And Nikhil, the idea of evolutionary mismatch that I learned about from your article is so important to reframe our understanding of the mental health challenges faced by caregivers in WEIRD, weird societies, and beyond, really. So welcome, Nikhil. Excited to hear more about your research a little later. I'm also delighted to introduce Annie Swanepoel, who is Nikhil's co-author in this edition. She is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Northeast London NHS Foundation Trust. And Annie writes with a lot of vulnerability in her share of the article, how when Nikhil showed her the data from his work, she was astonished by the idea that half the time when a baby cried in the community, someone other than the mother would step in. And we will later hear from Annie about how this now informs her work. Welcome, Annie. Next, please join me in welcoming Lucy Jones, author of the wonderful book Matrescence. Lucy is based out of Hampshire in the UK. And I think everything we will discuss today will, in a sense, culminate in the messages that Lucy shares in that book, which is both an indictment, I think, of the current social order and a manifesto for the kind of hopeful society that we need to build. And perhaps the most striking advice in your piece, Lucy, for us to create a culture where self-reliance is de-glamorized and help-seeking is normalized. Wow, that's truly radical. Shouldn't be, but it is. Lucy, thanks so much for being here. All right, we will hop on to some questions, just some housekeeping. Please feel free to drop your questions, comments, thoughts in the chat box, and we will circle back to them at the very end. Our speakers will speak for about 3 to 4 minutes in response to my preliminary questions, and then we'll try and see if we can sort of fit in a couple more questions because I'm sure there will be stuff that they will share that is not on my script. Okay, if we could start with you, Sabrina. Tell us, how has supporting caregivers, both in their capacity as parents as well as professionals, how has that translated into the flourishing of the children and the communities that Kidogo serves?
Thanks, Tanmoy. And you started by talking about Lydia, who's one of our mamapreneurs that we mentioned in the article. Lydia is incredible. And there are 1,500 others like her in Kenya within Kidogo's network of childcare centers. And they are what we call our mamapreneurs. These are women who combine the nurturing, loving qualities of a mother or a mama and the hustle and the grittiness and the resourcefulness of being an entrepreneur. And through Kidogo's support, mamapreneurs run profitable childcare micro-businesses in their communities. That's a win-win-win. It's good for children who receive safe, stimulating, nurturing experiences during their vital first few years of life while their parents go to work. It's good for mothers, like Dina, who we hear in the article is a mom of twin baby girls living in an informal settlement in Nairobi who struggle to find childcare. And in Kenya, like in many parts of the world, there's no public childcare system. Pre-primary schooling doesn't begin until the age of 4. And what's becoming more of a reality, especially in urban settings, is that grandparents aren't available to support. So mothers like Dina must resort to using childcare centers that are unsafe and unpredictable. And we hear in the story that her babies are losing weight because they're not being fed. And it was only when she switched to a Kidogo center, run by a mamapreneur called Lydia, that she finally experiences what she calls peace of mind. And I think so much of this issue on caregiving well-being is about peace of mind. Peace of mind to work, peace of mind knowing that your children are safe, peace of mind that you're doing just fine as a parent and that you have everything that you need within you. And within the context of childcare, peace of mind is, I think, less about the facility or the curriculum, although those things are important. It really does come down to the childcare operator, the mamapreneur like Lydia. And that's the third win that we see. These are women with often no more than a primary school education who are taught the basics of early childhood development as well as entrepreneurship. But the first topic that they go through with Kidogo is confidence. Who are you? Not just what do you do, but who are you as a person? What are your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations? And then they form communities of practice where they get to meet other mamapreneurs to share challenges and successes and find that sense of belonging that all caregivers need. And before we know it, they start to see themselves differently. There's a pride and a power that's beautiful to watch. They're running profitable childcare micro-businesses, earning 2 times more and employing additional caregivers in order to keep up with the demand of children. So ultimately, I think supporting the well-being of childcare operators is critical if we want thriving children. Globally, childcare tends to be undercompensated, under-recognized, and an underappreciated sector. And yet, when parents are working, it's childcare operators that are doing the brunt of the caregiving. As we hear Lydia in the article say, parents used to think all the daycare did was kazi wa pati, it's Swahili for toilet work, literally changing diapers all day long. But what they do is so much more than that. They're shaping the minds of the little ones, the next generation, and they're helping to unlock the economic potential for mothers who are then able to work. I think we need to do more as a sector, and I'm hoping this article propels us to have the conversations around shifting the mindset to support childcare operators and to position them as professionals. And I think that is when we will start to see flourishing families, flourishing communities, and ultimately flourishing countries.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sabrina. I remember when I was going through your website right at the inception of this edition, I had so many questions, and I think everyone needs to read this piece because it, in I don't know what, 1,200 words, it really opens up storylines that are so empowering and so great to discover. So thank you, Sabrina, for writing and for sharing this introduction to your work. Harriet, we know that parents and other caregivers are feeling the heat, quite literally. Everyday challenges, global crises like climate change. Tell us, how is this really impacting the well-being? Because we have a kind of fuzzy idea. We talk a lot about the toll on young people, but we don't necessarily always hold space for parents and caregivers and slightly older people. So, how is this impacting their well-being? And how can they start a conversation about these really complex topics with their children?
Thanks, Tanmoy, and it's wonderful to be here. And I think that climate change actually is evident and a thread that weaves its way through almost all of the journal entries. The journal talks, all of the articles talk about that isolationism, being alone, the importance of community, of coming together. And with climate change, and as parents become parents, as we begin parenting, as was discussed in one of the articles, this anxiety and the response because of the climate crisis can bring almost a paralyzing impact onto someone, because all of a sudden you're adding on to your job as a parent. You have to be truth teller and safety keeper as it relates to the climate crisis. So protecting our children in the light of the reality of the climate crisis really can be overwhelming. So that importance of community, of finding our community to be able to help support us as parents and caregivers is critical. So, but I'd like to step back for a moment broadly on this issue of climate change. It's a threat multiplier, right? It makes everything worse. It's number 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals, but as we know, with all of the 17 goals, they're interconnected. And climate change, again, through all of that, if we don't address that crisis, how are we going to, it throws everything off. So as a parent, even from our babies to our young children who are 2, 3, 4, feeling the pressures of extreme weather events, and they're looking to us as the truth tellers, as the trusted messenger. That can be overwhelming in every respect. Everything else that we heard from Sabrina, being that mompreneur, if you're dealing with the crisis of the climate, the impacts of the climate crisis, how do we do that? So in our work with Our Kids Climate, we bring together parent groups from around the world, where the network allows interactions, cohorts through our fellowship program, through our small grants program. And what we see, and what I think is evident in the articles in the journal, is that the pressures and concerns are the same the world over. Yes, different in different ways, but that importance of finding your people, of finding your community, to be able to share the angst, the anxiety, to build hope in the space of what may seem impossible odds is really, really important. And so some of the, I'd say that, the 5 items we bring out in the journal article are that importance of talking about this, of talking about the concerns, the anxiety, the hopelessness, and then moving through that to resolve. And how do we walk through that? Connecting with community, exploring that idea of radical hope, even in the face of what we know is only, how are we slowing this down? But as it gets worse, how do we deal with it? How do our children grow up and thrive in what we know is going to be and continue to be a complicated and difficult future with the climate crisis? How do we practice radical joy? How do we find joy in all of those places and spaces that are forever changed because of climate change? So those are some of the areas I'd love to explore them further that we bring up in this journal entry. And I think it's wonderful to have that opportunity and to see how the journal comes together and pulls all of these different parts together as climate change weaves its way through them all.
Thanks, Harriet. I would also urge everyone here to read our interview with the economist Fabrizio Zelibotti and his idea of the parenting gap. As Harriet was talking to us about the importance of having these conversations, Fabrizio's interview reminds us that in disadvantaged families, people from marginalized backgrounds, etc., they simply don't have the time to have these conversations. And therefore, for those of us who do, learning that language is really the easy part. And Harriet's article filled me with a lot of hope for something that I find very, very difficult to pull off with my 6-year-old. He's not talked to me about climate change yet, but I'm sure we'll need to have that conversation soon. Nikhil, now we increasingly hear that parents in Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies are isolated and lonely and burning out. What are some of the key insights that we need to pay attention to from your research on the evolution of human societies?
Thanks. So I work with hunter-gatherers, and maybe I can just quickly explain what that means, what a hunter-gatherer is, and as such, why that can help us understand our evolution and this discordance we see in industrialized high-income societies and the way that the children are reared. So I'm an anthropologist, and broadly speaking, we tend to split societies by their subsistence mode, and that can be hunting and gathering, where you just rely on wild foods, you don't practice any cultivation or farming. And then you've got agro-pastoralist societies who are agriculturalists and cattle keepers. And then, as you mentioned, Tanmoy, the weird societies, we call them Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. And the reason we are particularly interested in working with hunter-gatherers is because this is how our species lived for the vast majority of our history, right? We've been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years, and until only about 10,000 years ago, we lived as hunter-gatherers. So more than 95% of our history, we were hunter-gatherers. And as such, if we're trying to understand what it means to be human, which I'd say is the fundamental question in anthropology, it's really hunting and gathering and contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that can offer an insight into that. If we live this way for the majority of our history, then it's this way of life that may well have shaped and be the drivers, and that lifestyle and the challenges our species have faced as hunter-gatherers that has driven our evolution, the evolution of our brains, our body, our behavior. And that's why we want to study hunter-gatherers. We want to understand how our species came to be the way we are. And one thing that evolutionary anthropologists see in hunter-gatherers around the world, across continents, those last remaining societies living in this way, is child rearing. There's a fairly normative practice of cooperative child rearing. So, or we call it alloparenting, where individuals beyond the parents are involved in rearing children. And now what is fairly well established is that what separates humans, what makes us human and separates us from our closest relatives like chimpanzees, is that we raise children together, or at least we have traditionally done this. It allowed us, that's what really allowed us to conquer the globe, this highly cooperative, extended family structure, we could say. So to give you some insights from my data, we found that children may be looked after over a 12-hour period, may be looked after by about 15 different caregivers. And as you mentioned earlier, about half of their care is coming from individuals other than the mother, including responding to crying. So I think what this tells us is that at the heart of being human, for the majority of our species' history, was raising children in a collaborative, cooperative manner, where alloparenting was really fundamental. And now we're living, again, in weird societies, in these Western high-income industrialized societies, in such a distinct way, where society is organized and families are organized around a nuclear family, rather than these extended camps of about 50 people with multiple families living communally, as we see in hunter-gatherers. And that is really putting a lot of pressure on parents. And we talk about this idea of evolutionary mismatch, which is where there's some aspect of the way we're living now, which is distinct from the way we evolved to live, let's say, and that can lead to all sorts of diseases or problems with our well-being, and can lead to pathology or maladaptive behavior. And I really think this is a fundamental evolutionary mismatch, that parents just don't have the support, don't have those other 10 caregivers helping look after their children. So it's no wonder they're exhausted and struggling so frequently. And yeah, maybe Annie, who will be speaking next, can give you a bit more insight into the realities of that in her practice.
Thanks, Nikhil. One of the reasons I really hope that this edition reaches a lot of people is because reading some of this stuff was so validating. I think we really need to hear this stuff. And like I said in the beginning, some of this is very commonsensical, but when somebody with the authority of all of this research puts it out there, it just becomes so much more powerful. So thanks, Nikhil, once again. Coming to you, Annie, yeah, how do you see the principles that Nikhil talks about impacting the parents and families that you interact with? You've shared a very compelling story. You may or may not want to reveal that story, but I leave that decision to you.
Well, Tanmoy, I wanted to start by saying that I listened to you talking about a fumbling father, and then thought, well, perhaps I'm a mother who has muddled through. I have two sons who are now adults. And what I found so interesting when talking to Nikhil and finding out about his research is that I had no clue. So I'm a doctor, I'm a child psychiatrist, and I did not get any kind of training in evolution and what people are adapted to cope with. So when Nikhil told me that with the alloparenting, about alloparenting, and that if you just look at a baby who cries, more than 40% of the time, it's somebody other than the mother who responds. I was so blown away by that, because I think all of us who've had a baby, can you imagine how much easier that would be if you only had to respond to half of the cries, if there were other people around who helped? And I then realized that that had a significant impact for women who suffer from postnatal depression, for example, who feel that they are not good enough, who feel that it's overwhelming to have a baby. And I realized that it is overwhelming to have a baby. We are not adapted to be able to look after babies on our own, especially as a single mother. It is an impossible task. And that is something which I think is a message we really need to feed through, because I think it could also lead to women feeling more comfortable to seek support and not feel that there's something wrong with them if they're struggling to cope. But Nikhil's research and just understanding more about hunter-gatherers and anthropology has other implications as well, because there are things like how babies are carried all the time, how they are getting so much skin-to-skin contact. So how much babies actually need, and how it's possible for them to get all that if there's a multitude of caregivers, but really overwhelming for people to do that on their own, which really indicates to us that we need to think broader. And I grew up in South Africa, and I knew the saying of it takes a village to raise a child. But it really hit home that we're not supposed to be raising babies and children on our own. And Western parents who live in these kind of societies where it's expected are doing much more than what they are evolutionarily adapted to do. And that is where the mismatch theory comes in. So that brings us to potential solutions, which maybe have not been thought about that much. And that might be involving older siblings in care. It might be, I was even thinking whether it might be worth involving teenagers in care. So even non-related teenagers, there could be clubs for teenagers to learn how to care for babies. And because by getting involved in that, it's not just of benefit for the parents of the babies, it's also of benefit for the teenagers who then have more experience when they go on to have their own families. So we really need to think in a more, in a broader way and incorporate other people as well. I know in Germany, they're thinking about putting old age homes next to nurseries, which would be of benefit for the children, but would definitely also be of benefit for the elderly people. So we need a more holistic approach. So that's why I was so delighted to also read what the other people in this journal have done, because it's just amazing. I'm so glad things are going in the right direction.
Thank you, Annie. Just to riff off of what Annie said about expanding the definition of caregiver, this is actually something that we've wrestled throughout this process with. And so in this journal, you will see we always mention parents and other caregivers. Honestly, I don't have a good answer to how to expand the definition in one word. Perhaps there isn't one word, and perhaps we need to become comfortable with that, and very, very aware that parents do occupy the bulk of this discourse, and that there are very many other groups of caregivers that we perhaps aren't able to hold space to as much as we should. So thank you, Annie, for that reminder. And because you mentioned the German example, again, I'd highly recommend reading the piece that we have on the care blocks in Bogota, and the amazing juxtaposition of different identities, different age groups, and the results, the outcomes that is fostering. Lucy, first of all, am I pronouncing matrescence right? Is it the same as adolescence? Okay, awesome. Where do we begin this journey of reimagining how we can better support the well-being of parents and caregivers? I just gave a very simple one-liner when I was introducing you by saying that we need to abandon this glamorization of self-reliance and lean into seeking help. Tell us, where do we begin to go on that journey?
Thank you, Tanmoy, and thank you for having me. It's a real honour and delight to be with you all today. So I think the framework and the word matrescence could be quite helpful and radical for us, for everyone. A bit of background about where my work is coming from. I had my first child in 2016 and entered motherhood with an idea that parenting was serious and challenging work, and a real joy for my much wanted and beloved daughter. But the experience was a major shock for me. Pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood. My matrescence was typical of my culture in England, of kind of isolated, intensive motherhood, husband going back to work after 2 weeks, a bit of maternity leave, but kind of working at that as well at the same time. being quite alone, coming up against kind of very hostile infrastructure for parents and young children. Eventually, I was, like many new mothers, diagnosed with postnatal depression. And for the first kind of 9 months or so, I felt incredibly weird, and that I was undergoing a psychological, emotional, yes, physical, existential, spiritual metamorphosis. Beforehand, I'd thought that pregnancy was a kind of one-time transient hormonal event, and when the baby was born, I'd go back to myself. After 9 months, I would go back to work as normal, but instead I felt very different and very vulnerable and quite fragile. And then about 9 months in, I read this word which changed everything for me. Sorry, I'm just gonna, it's asking me to say my language to help the translation. So I'm just doing that now. In an article in the New York Times by Alexandra Sachs, and it was the word matrescence, a word I had never seen before, had never considered that something would be happening to me, rather than a kind of change in my everyday life of being a parent. So the word matrescence was coined by the late American anthropologist Dana Raphael in the 1970s. She was, as I said, an anthropologist, and she wrote an essay about how in most cultures and societies in the world, becoming a mother is seen as the central life crisis for a woman. And it is psychological, emotional, involves changes in identity, changes in relationship, changes in social changes, and so on. And that there are often rites or rituals or ceremonies to acknowledge this seismic change. In many cultures, she said, a newborn is born and also a mother is born, and that the mother must be mothered. And when I read this word, it gave me a framework to start talking to other mothers. And I'm a science journalist, a health journalist, and I started thinking about what matrescence is like for us right now in our history, which, as Michael mentioned at the beginning, is an extraordinary coalescence of kind of unique cultural moments, us, women working more, us living a kind of post-Bowlby, post-attachment theory world, which to my mind has very much been interpreted to leave out the role of society and community and focus very much on the mother-infant dyad, to rising costs of living, need for dual income households, etc., and people not living close to their families and so on. But one of the things that I noticed in my research and in my interviews with other mothers, many of whom I realized were similarly struggling and experiencing mental illness, burnout, stress, exhaustion, was how strong to use Arlie Hochskald's phrase, the feeling rules were around this time, and how much stigma and taboo there was in feeling vulnerable and asking for help and talking honestly about the challenges of becoming a mother or becoming a father. Someone needs to write a book called Matrescence as well. And I think that these feeling rules are no small thing. They really serve to isolate people from each other. And I think matrescence, the word matrescence, the concept of a matrescence is a way of shining a light on this vulnerable time. And I'll finish in a second, but in the last 5 to 10 years, and much of my research has been looking at this, we have a lot of new work about how much becoming a parent changes the brain. So in 2016, the first landmark studies were published by Elseline Hoeksma, which showed that pregnancy renders significant and pronounced changes to the maternal brain. And now we know that those changes are as significant as the changes that happen in adolescence. And also, as we all know, and as the previous speakers have explained so beautifully, we evolved in caregiving networks, and we all have the neural brain circuitry to be caregivers. So early studies are showing that hands-on caregiving changes the anatomy of the father's brains, and presumably that would mean non-birth mother brains, caregiver brains. So we all have the ability to have brains which are changed by looking after children. But one of the things this plasticity of the brain means is vulnerability. So this new science of motherhood and parenthood, I think, has come at a good time for the concept of matrescence, because it underlines how much support people need as they enter parenthood.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm particularly grateful to you for bringing up the idea of matrescence. And this is something that it was on my wish list, because often we don't account for the sort of neurobiological changes that the father goes through, and it's very heartening to see that conversation beginning, to take place. And thank you for your leadership in that regard as well. Nothing pleases a moderator more than when speakers stick to their allotted time. So thank you to all of you for doing that. Some fantastic comments and questions. We have the time to go into some of them. So let's begin. Some of them are questions, some of them are comments. There are a few that are directed at specific speakers, and some that any of you can sort of jump in and respond to. Svetlana has said holistic models, like Annie has mentioned, bringing teenagers and kids and older people and kids together can be a game changer for many mental health issues plaguing adolescents and older people, perhaps. Absolutely. James has said this conversation is pointing to the need, in addition to focusing on caregiver well-being, to create supportive caregiving environments that surround individual families. Big thumbs up. Caring for children is a community task, Omulara says. And is this accepted? I'm assuming you meant to say worldwide, Omulara. Does anybody have a quick response to that? Is this becoming some kind of a global epiphany that caring for children is a community task? If somebody has a quick one, or we can just sort of do a survey, just a show of hands, perhaps.
I'll just jump in there and say, I almost don't think it is an epiphany, because it was taken for granted until very recently in very specific areas of the globe. I mean, if you look across humanity, across time and space, it's quite rare actually for it to just be a parental task. So in some sense, rather than it being an epiphany, I think it's only now that in some places of the globe it's not taken for granted, and that's where the epiphany is happening. But in most places, and certainly out of industrialized contexts, the idea of parents doing it alone is very abnormal already, and has always been.
I also have to say, again, in the early stages when we were discussing this edition, the idea that weird societies are going through their own sort of struggles, this isolation, burnout, this often does not take into account the fact that a lot of other societies are facing exactly the same crisis for different reasons, perhaps. So I often struggle with the romanticization of non-weird societies as societies that are pristine in some sense and that do not have these struggles. So just, that nuance is important. And that's why the diversity of voices in this edition hopefully drives home that aspect as well for all of you. Daniela says, thanks, Nikhil. And that pressure surely is worse when raising a little child with disabilities alone without that extended family and community you're talking about. Absolutely. Raising a child with disability, raising a child when you have disability, when you live with disability yourself, anything that pushes you down the sort of intersectional sweepstakes, the problem just magnifies. So excellent point, Daniela, and thank you for mentioning that. Jane has a question. Can the presenters comment on the role and well-being of frontline ECD professionals who have a close-in seat to the ups and downs of the families they serve? Are we considering their place in this work and in theories of change? And she disclaims by saying that this is indeed her dissertation topic. So anybody fancy taking a stab at that?
I can jump in. And actually on the previous comment of this collective, the co-raising of a child, I think in the communities that we work in, which are informal settlements, urban slums in Kenya, and we're seeing this a lot, is that is being eroded. We're seeing families move from rural to urban areas where the dynamics are quite different, where you used to have grandparents and aunts and family support, extended family support. You no longer have that in these urban informal settlements, and moms need to work. And that's where we're getting this idea of more of the weird societies, and yet seeing that in these places of informal settlements. And I wonder if there are ways to redesign, and I think Bernard Van Leer Foundation does a great job of the Urban 95, redesigning cities and urban contexts as we're seeing more migration, as we're seeing increases in women's employment, to try and get back to some of those things that I think we've lost with this. I do think early childhood caregivers and operators are frontline workers. And we saw that during COVID, that they take a lot of the brunt of not just the child rearing and caring for children, but also caring for families, caring for maternal well-being and mental health. And undercompensated, underrecognized, underappreciated. Childcare often don't have the safety nets that they need economically and socially. And one way that we are tackling this is, can we have these communities of practice, this peer learning, where running a childcare center is quite lonely. You get your first child at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning. Your last child picked up at 7, 8 p.m. You're doing this day in, day out by yourself. And hopefully by coming together with other mamapreneurs, you are providing that sense of support. But I do think that this is paramount to the conversation of well-being of our caregivers, whether they be parents or childcare operators.
Tanwa, can I jump in and just add to that?
Yeah, of course.
So I think as we reach this, we're moving towards this impending cliff with the climate crisis. And there was a question just in there as well, too. We need not to just put the pressure on the shoulders of the caregivers of that community. We need policymakers involved in this discussion. We need it at a real, from the international level to the state to the local, to understand the connections here that early childhood caregivers and parents and caregivers need that support. We're seeing a rise in understanding in mental health care providers. That's an area that's just expanding greatly in the last 3 to 5 years, the studies, the work on that, but we need to raise that up to a level so that there is broad support. And I don't think, we're having those conversations, but it actually needs to be actualized, because the climate crisis is here. It's impacting people now, and that adds just that much heavier of a burden on parents and caregivers.
Thank you, Harriet. Some very, very insightful comments. Margaret has a question that I would also want answered. How do we go back in time to relive the culture where caregiving was a collective effort? In the context of declining trust and connectedness in society? Yeah, somebody has to answer this because I think we all need that time machine.
Well, I don't think we should have to go back in time for that. Absolutely not. With everything that Nikhil has told me about hunter-gatherers, I am very grateful that I am not a hunter-gatherer. I am very grateful that I have modern medicine and that I can sleep in a clean, comfortable bed. So no, I don't think we should be nostalgic and wanting to go back to the past. What we need to do is to become aware of what it is we need, what it is we have evolutionarily and psychologically adapted to, and then use that knowledge to tweak our modern environments and lessen the mismatch between how it's easy for us and how things currently are. So no, we definitely don't have to go back or design a time machine.
I was thinking that you would give us the blueprint and the engineering details, but alas. Lucy, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that certainly in the society I live in, like the work of the brilliant work of Nikhil and like Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, the work on kind of evolutionary, how we evolved in collective caregiving networks, isn't really known. So I think, you know, what I see is mothers feeling feeling like they have to do it all and that they should be on their own all day with their child, and that's traditional and that's the norm and that's the way it should be. Of course, they have to work as well, so you know, lots of stress, and not really realizing that it, you know, we didn't evolve in this way. And I think that compounds shame. And if, you know, if these ideas were more out there, that we realize that actually this is an unusual and failing experiment, that could, you know, restore us to this, to I don't know, a society which is kinder.
Yeah, can I just jump in on a follow-on from that, if that's okay, which is to say, Annie and I completely agree with what you just said, Lucy. Especially, it's actually in complete contrast. The narratives that are around, like you said, there's this slight misunderstanding of attachment theory, which some people have just focused on the mother, and then you have these narratives around, you know, the maternal instinct and this idea that the mother should just be able to manage and know what to do, and it should be instinctive. So Annie and I are hoping to combat that a bit with a project we're trying with one of the NHS trusts in the UK, where we're going to be co-producing with mothers who've had postnatal depression or other perinatal mental health problems, a information sheet where we'll present some of our work about cooperative child rearing and how fundamental that's been in human evolution and how common it is in other cultures and different ways of living. And that leaflet, that information sheet, hopefully, you know, could help reduce some of that guilt and shame and combat these narratives that a mum should know how to do it all herself and there's something wrong with her maternal instinct if she doesn't, by showing that actually what is natural or a biological norm is that we evolved in these cooperative contexts. So as you say, just the knowledge of it may be therapeutic in and of itself.
Yeah, therapeutic is a good word to describe this edition. Finally, I'd just like to raise this question. I don't think we have the time because this is really an encyclopedic question, but it's an excellent question, I think, to wrap up the Q&A. And this is from Rachel, and she says the emphasis is often on parenting support and education, which often involves peer connections, but usually focuses on supporting changes to parent practices or behaviors. And she asks, how can we better combine these kinds of approaches with the clear need for expanding the circle of carers that support children? There is an incredible piece on drum circles in Brazil that I would urge Rachel, you and everybody else to read, that might hold some clues to your question, but it's a great question. Thank you so much. I think we've done very well on time. Thank you to all the speakers. All of you asked such insightful questions, left such comments. And just to wrap up, and before I hand it over to Mike again, it's just so, I just feel so grateful that something that we did not really, and no journal can perhaps really intentionally design an edition where every story will speak to each other. And that is exactly what has ended up happening. And I think I didn't mention it, but all of you did. And that goes to, goes to show that there is a certain universality. Universality is a very problematic word in these contexts, but I do think that there is something that we really can learn from these experiences from different parts of the world. And once again, thank you all very much. Mike, would you do the honors? Please feel free to jump back in.
Thanks, Tanmoy. And thanks to all the speakers. As I said at the beginning, this is sort of the opening of we hope is a longer conversation. We decided to focus Early Childhood Matters this year and also next year on this topic because we knew it was so big that we couldn't cover it in one go, but also because we thought it would be valuable to prompt conversation. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is what should we be diving into in the next edition and how should we cover it? So we would love for you to reach out with your ideas. We have a wonderful advisory board this year, and because of what we're living through in many parts of the world and many countries we work in, war is certainly something that we're going to look at, and how parents in such extreme environments is something that I think, had we started on this edition later, we finished in September, we would have done earlier, but that's one. There have been some discussions around artificial intelligence, but the menu is open. And so we're really extending an invitation to reach out and tell us what you think we should be covering, and also to reach out to the authors. There are a lot of practical examples of what it might look like to merge the time when we all cared for kids together with a more modern or more present time, what those two things look like together. I think there's some really good examples of that. The last thing I would say, though, in terms of, I wanted to share one reflection of where I think we're having difficulty making progress. And I spend a lot of time in my job imagining or trying to remember what it was like to be a baby and a toddler. Because I don't know about you, I don't have a lot of memories. They start later for some reason for me, so I can't really remember. So I do a lot of work, and so I try to imagine a pretty long period, 3, 4, 5 years, not just a moment, where my brain is changing, my body is soft, it's reorganizing all the time, it's not totally dependable, where everything, I'm in awe of everything, so much so that then suddenly I just fall asleep because I'm so tired of being in awe. I have these feelings, but I don't have the words to say them, and it's very difficult. It's very frustrating. My social relationships, I'm establishing new ones. They're changing. My web of family and of love is changing radically all the time, and out of it, I'm becoming a person that has an identity. And I've always thought of this as a good way of imagining or reimagining what it's like to be a baby. But after this issue, I think it's also a really good description of what it's like to become a parent. And so to add to Lucy's sort of, what if we looked at parenthood the way we looked at adolescence, I would say, what if we also looked at parenthood the way we have come to look at early childhood? And to paraphrase something that she said in her article, I think quoting from someone else, when someone asks you, why are you focused on parents' well-being, on caregiver well-being, maybe try saying to them, remember every time a child is born, a mother is born, a caregiver is born, a father is born, and try to imagine culturally, if we looked at it like that, how might we take care of them differently? And so we'd love to hear your answers to that in the coming year, or the answers by which you're inspired from other people, so that we can come back in a year and publish some more and continue trying to put this on the top of the public agenda. Thank you. And thank you, Tanmoy, for all that you've done for this journal and this process.
All right, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you once again for showing up, and please do read the journal and spread the word. Bye-bye.